My name is Hannah. I am 23 years old, and on Christmas night, Jasmine and Jameson locked me out of their smart home in the snow without a coat. I stood on the freezing porch in my scrubs. Through the glass, Jasmine sneered, "You can't do anything on your own. Hannah, you're pathetic." Behind her, Cody pulled the curtains shut. The next morning, shivering, I drove to the bank to use an old card Christian had left me, hoping for gas money. The manager swiped it, looked at her screen, and went white. "Ma'am," she whispered, "please sit down. You need to see this." If you have ever been called pathetic by the exact same people who were secretly using you to survive, let me know where you are watching from and what time it is right now in the comments. Everything was about to change. The bank manager's name was Nora. She wore a crisp navy blazer, and her hands were physically trembling as she held my grandfather's worn plastic card. I didn't cry. I did not shake. Even though the frostbite was still biting at my fingers from the night before, I simply sat perfectly straight in the heavy leather chair, breathing evenly, and waiting. Years of working in the emergency room had trained me for this exact kind of silence. When a heart monitor flatlines, you do not panic. You assess the room, you look at the data, you act. Nora swallowed hard, breaking the quiet hum of the air conditioner. She turned the heavy desktop monitor around so it faced me. The bright blue glow illuminated the small, sterile office. I fully expected to see a balance of maybe $50, just enough for a tank of gas and a cheap motel room on the highway. That was what Jasmine had always told me. She loved to say that Christian was a sentimental old fool who left me a useless checking account just to make himself feel better before he passed away. Jasmine was a liar. The screen did not show $50. It showed an irrevocable trust, a legally binding, ironclad financial fortress. And my name was the only one written on the beneficiary line. Nora pointed a shaking finger to a specific row on the digital ledger. "Hannah," she said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent murmur. "Do you understand what you are looking at right now?" I traced the numbers with my eyes. I read the legal descriptions. I scanned the asset list. "The property," I said. My voice was completely steady. "The house in Seattle." "Yes," Nora nodded quickly. "The smart home, the entire estate. It does not belong to Jameson. It does not belong to Jasmine. Christian bought it outright 3 years ago when Jameson's architectural firm faced severe bankruptcy. He placed it in this trust. On your 21st birthday, full and total ownership transferred to you." I sat there in the cold air of the bank. The realization washed over me, clear and sharp like cracked ice. The $1 million glass mansion I had just been locked out of. The house where I was treated like an unpaid servant. The house where I paid the expensive utility bills with my nursing salary because Jasmine claimed times were tough for the family. It was my house. For 2 entire years. They had been living in my home. They had treated me like a stray dog begging for scraps on my own property. Jasmine had stood behind my front door, looking through my glass, and called me pathetic. I looked at the digital clock on the bottom of the screen. It was 9:30 in the morning. Jameson was probably waking up, brewing his expensive artisan coffee. Jasmine was probably doing her morning yoga on the heated floors. The floors I owned. "There is more," Nora said gently. She clicked another tab on the screen. "You need to see the withdrawal history." I leaned forward in the chair. I was not a victim anymore. I felt nothing but focus. Looking at the new screen, a strange, absolute clarity replaced the confusion in my mind. People always wonder why someone stays in a toxic environment for so long. They ask why an educated, 23-year-old emergency room nurse would willingly hand over her hard-earned paycheck to her parents and accept being locked out in the snow. It is because of the normalization trap. Jasmine was a master at it. As a former chief financial officer, she knew exactly how to balance a corporate ledger, and she applied that exact same ruthless mathematics to my existence. From the time I was a young child, She programmed me to believe I was a massive liability, a walking, breathing debt that could never fully be repaid. When you are told every single day that you are a burden, you start trying to buy your right to exist. I worked exhausting double shifts at the hospital just to pay the exorbitant electric bills for Jameson's precious smart home system. I bought the expensive organic groceries. I cleaned the pristine white countertops until my hands were raw. I thought I was earning my place in the family. I thought I was fixing the terrible defect that was me. But looking at Nora's screen, the brutal math finally made sense. Look here. Nora pointed her manicured finger at a series of bright red numbers on the adjoining screen. This is Jameson and Jasmine's joint checking account. It is completely drained. Overdrawn by $24,000. I stared at the negative balances. The image of Jasmine's designer clothes and Jameson's exclusive country club memberships flashed in my mind. They were living a lie. A very expensive, hollow, pathetic lie. They are broke, I stated. It was a simple fact, not an insult. Worse than broke, Nora corrected, her tone grim. They are desperate, and they have been trying to breach your trust fund for the last 6 months. They have filed multiple legal inquiries to access the equity in your home. They need the capital to cover their massive debts. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with terrifying speed. The cruelty last night wasn't a random emotional outburst. The Christmas Eve fight wasn't about me forgetting to buy Cody his favorite imported wine. It was a calculated, theatrical execution. By locking me out in the freezing snow with nothing but the scrubs on my back, they were trying to break my spirit. They wanted me to come crawling back, shivering and desperate. They knew that if I was broken enough, I would sign anything just to get warm. Tomorrow morning, Jasmine was planning to slide a power of attorney document across the kitchen island. She was going to tell me it was for my own good. They wanted to steal my house to save their pride. I didn't feel angry. Anger is hot, blinding, and messy. What I felt was absolute, freezing precision. The kind of precision you need to clamp a bleeding artery. Jasmine had always told me I was weak. She thought I was too soft to survive the winter. She had no idea that the cold was exactly what was going to keep me awake. Can they break the trust? I asked quietly. No, Nora said firmly. It is ironclad. The illusion was completely dead. The silence in the bank manager's office felt like the calm eye of a massive hurricane. The family I thought I was trying to save did not exist. They were never a family. They were just two desperate parasites disguised in tailored suits, feeding off the ghost of my grandfather's generosity and my own misplaced guilt. I need a lawyer, I said quietly, looking directly into Nora's eyes. Someone who specializes in trust funds and asset protection. Not someone polite. I need someone surgical. Nora gave a tight, deeply approving smile. She reached into her polished mahogany desk drawer and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored business card. It had simple black lettering. Marlene Barker, attorney at law. Marlene is the best in Seattle, Nora said, handing the card across the desk. She does not lose. I will call her personally right now and tell her you are coming. I took the card. The edges were sharp and clean. It felt like the very first real weapon I had ever held in my life. I left the bank and drove my beat-up sedan to a cheap motel on the industrial edge of the city. The room smelled like stale smoke and heavy bleach, but the heater worked perfectly. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress and looked at my phone. It was completely silent. 12 hours had passed since Jasmine locked the heavy front door. There were no missed calls. No texts asking if I was safe in the snow. No voicemails from Cody. They were playing a psychological waiting game. They were sitting in my heated, $1,000,000 glass cage, waiting for the pathetic stray dog to come scratching at the glass. I plugged my phone into the wall. I did not text them back. Instead, I took a hot shower. I put my wrinkled hospital scrubs back on. I drove to the hospital for my overnight shift. Walking through the sliding doors of the emergency room, the familiar chaos washed over me. Ambulances wailed in the bay. Heart monitors beeped in a steady rhythm. Nurses shouted for trauma kits. This was my real home. This was a place where things were honest. Blood is honest. Pain is honest. I worked my 12-hour shift with a terrifying level of calm. I stitched deep lacerations. I administered heavy medications. I charted patient vitals with absolute, perfect accuracy. Every single time my phone buzzed in my pocket, I ignored it. I knew it was them. The panic was probably starting to set in on their end. The dog wasn't scratching at the door. Their flawless plan was falling apart. At 6 a.m, as the pale sun began to rise over the icy city skyline, I finally clocked out. I walked out to my car. The morning air was biting, but I barely felt it. I held Marlene's cream-colored business card in my hand. Jasmine always said I was entirely useless without her guidance. She was about to find out exactly how efficient I could be. I started the car engine. The hunt had officially begun. To truly understand the depth of Jameson and Jasmine's delusion, you have to understand the rigid architecture of our past. I drove toward the law office, watching the gray city slide by the window, and let myself remember the sterile museum they called a childhood home. Jameson was an architect obsessed with high-end modernism. Everything in our house had to be sharp, made of glass, and perfectly transparent. Jasmine, the ever-calculating financial officer, treated our family exactly like a corporate merger. There was absolutely no room for error, and there was certainly no room for warmth. In their perfectly curated ecosystem, my younger brother Cody was the undeniable golden child. He was loud, effortlessly charming, and looked exactly like Jameson in his youth. He was the prime asset. I was the liability. I was quiet, deeply observant, and I had my grandfather Christian's dark eyes. I clearly remembered a dinner party when I was 10 years old. Jameson had invited his wealthiest corporate clients over to show off his latest home design. I had spent hours drawing a careful picture for him, sitting rigidly on a stool so I wouldn't wrinkle my dress. When the important guests arrived, I tried to hand it to him. I just wanted him to look at me for 1 second. Jasmine intercepted me in the hallway before I could reach him. She didn't yell. She never yelled in public. She just gripped my thin wrist so hard, her manicured nails dug painfully into my skin. "Look at you," she hissed, her voice a poisonous, controlled whisper. "You have cheap marker on your fingers. You are a mess. Hannah, you are like a smudge of mud on a white rug. Go to your room and stay there until you can learn to fit in." I spent that entire night sitting in the pitch dark, listening to the clinking of expensive crystal glasses, and Cody's bright, celebrated laughter echoing from downstairs. I learned early on that in Jasmine and Jameson's world, love was not something you were freely given. It was a luxury commodity you had to purchase with absolute obedience. Everything I did was a defect that needed immediate fixing. If I laughed too loud, I was unrefined. If I got a B on a science test, I was lazy. They built a psychological cage of inadequacy around me, bar by bar, until I truly believed I was entirely broken. They needed me to feel impossibly small so they could feel gigantic. But as I parked my car outside Marlene Barker's upscale law firm, the old memories didn't hurt anymore. They were just data, cold, hard data in a legal file I was preparing to use against them. They thought they had shaped a weak, compliant victim. They didn't realize they had trained a hardened survivor. In their blind obsession with perfection, they forgot to account for the one variable they couldn't control. Christian had seen the truth, and Christian had left me a key. I stepped out into the freezing wind. I walked through the doors. Marlene Barker did not have a warm office. It was sleek, professional, and lined with heavy legal volumes. She sat across from me at a massive glass desk, carefully reading through the digital documents Nora had forwarded from the bank. The silence in the room was thick, but it was a productive, working silence. It gave me time to think about Christian. My grandfather was a quiet, observant man, while Jameson was busy designing flashy houses and Jasmine was obsessing over her country club status. Christian watched from the background. He was the only person who saw through Jasmine's flawless corporate mask. He saw the way she picked at my self-esteem. He saw the way Jameson treated me like an unwanted piece of furniture in his perfect architectural vision. I remembered the sterile smell of the intensive care unit 3 years ago. Christian was fading, his breathing assisted by a rhythmic, mechanical hum. I had sat by his bed for 14 hours straight, holding his frail hand. Because Jasmine and Jameson were too busy attending a charity gala to visit him. He had weakly pulled me closer and pressed that old, bent plastic card into my palm. His voice was a raspy whisper, but his eyes were entirely sharp. "They are going to try to break you, Hannah," he had said, coughing softly. "They only know how to take. When you have nowhere left to stand, this card will build you a wall. Promise me you won't let them take it." I had promised him without truly understanding the weight of his words. I thought it was just a small savings account, a sentimental gesture from a dying man. Marlene finally looked up from her computer screen. She pushed her reading glasses down the bridge of her nose. "Christian was a brilliant strategist," she said, her voice filled with deep professional respect. He knew Jameson's architectural firm was quietly hemorrhaging money. He knew they were drowning in debt behind their expensive lifestyle. So, he purchased the estate entirely in cash. He placed it into an irrevocable trust, completely bypassing probate. He essentially built a legal fortress around you that your parents cannot touch. I looked down at my hands. The frostbite from Christmas night was finally beginning to fade. The plastic card sitting on Marlene's desk wasn't just a piece of plastic, it was a shield. Christian had anticipated this exact moment. He had known they would eventually push me out into the cold. "They have been living in your house, Hannah," Marlene stated calmly. "And based on these banking inquiries, they have been desperately trying to find a legal loophole to seize the equity. They wanted to force you to sign over your rights." I felt a quiet, absolute stillness settle over my mind. I finally understood his wall. People often ask how an intelligent, capable adult allows themselves to be financially and emotionally abused by their own parents. The truth is, manipulation is a slow, methodical poison. It does not happen overnight. It happens over years of subtle conditioning until you truly believe you owe them your life. My career as an emergency room nurse was my only sanctuary. Inside the chaotic, brightly lit trauma bays, I was respected. I made split-second decisions that kept human hearts beating. I clamped bleeding arteries and stabilized shattered bones. Doctors trusted my judgment. Patients held my hand and thanked me. I was a competent, independent professional. But the moment I parked my car in the driveway of Jameson's immaculate smart home, I instantly reverted to being a useless burden. Jasmine had convinced me that living with them was an immense privilege. "We are providing you with a luxury lifestyle, Hannah," she would say, sipping her imported wine. "The least you can do is cover the basic utilities. It is only fair." I wanted to be fair. I wanted to be a good daughter. So, every single month, I handed over a massive portion of my nursing salary to pay the exorbitant bills. And the bills were staggering. Jameson's house was a technological monster. It consumed massive amounts of electricity to keep the servers running, the floors heated, and the automated blinds synchronized. I paid the power bill. I paid the high-speed internet bill. I paid for the expensive organic groceries that Jasmine demanded. I kept every single digital receipt and bank statement, believing I was simply doing my part for the family. Sitting in Marlene's office, I pulled out my phone and unlocked my banking app. I showed her the meticulously categorized history of my outgoing payments over the last 2 years. Marlene's eyes widened slightly as she scrolled through the sheer volume of transactions. A slow, sharp smile spread across her face. "Hannah," she said smoothly, "do you realize what this means in a court of law? I looked at her, waiting for the legal translation. If they ever try to claim that you were a dependent or that they were financially supporting you, these records will instantly destroy their argument. Marlene explained. You have been fully maintaining the property. You have been paying the taxes and the utilities on an estate that you legally own. They are the ones living rent-free. They are the dependents. I looked at the bright red numbers on my screen, the thousands of dollars I had poured into their illusion of wealth. I used to look at those numbers and feel a heavy, exhausting guilt. Now, they looked entirely different. They looked like ammunition. The receipts were my weapons. To comprehend the sheer cruelty of what Jameson did, you have to understand the architecture of his pride. The house in Seattle was not just a shelter, it was his ultimate masterpiece. It was an imposing structure of steel, polished concrete, and massive panels of tempered glass, hidden away in a secluded, heavily wooded suburb. More importantly, it was entirely digital. Jameson had wired the entire property to a central server. Everything was integrated. The security cameras, the magnetic door locks, the interior lighting, the refrigerator, and the complex climate control system were all connected to a single network. And Jameson held the only key. He controlled the entire house from a master application installed on his smartphone. It gave him an intoxicating sense of absolute power. For me, the house was a glass prison. I lived there, but I had absolutely no access rights. I was not allowed to download the app. If I was too loud in the kitchen, Jameson would silently dim the lights from his study to warn me. If Jasmine decided I had been disrespectful during dinner, Jameson would pick up his phone and drop the temperature in my bedroom to a freezing 60 degrees. I could not adjust the thermostat on the wall because it was locked behind a digital passcode. I could not open the front gate for a delivery driver without asking Jameson for permission. I was a ghost trapped inside a machine, existing entirely at the mercy of his fingertips. He loved it. He loved the invisible dominance. He felt like a god sitting in his leather chair, swiping a screen to make the physical world bend to his mood. They used the house to silently punish me. It was a clean, modern form of abuse. There were no bruises. There was no screaming. There was just the sudden, chilling drop in temperature. There was just the sound of a door locking itself when I walked into a room. They trained me to constantly monitor their moods. Because their moods dictated my physical comfort. I learned to sleep in heavy sweaters because I never knew when the heat would be cut off in the middle of the night. But as I sat in Marlene's office, drafting the legal documents that would shatter their reality, I realized the fatal flaw in Jameson's brilliant design. He had tied his entire sense of authority to a digital network. He believed his power came from the smartphone in his pocket. He forgot that a network is just a service, and a service only belongs to the person who holds the legal deed to the property. He thought he was the master of the house, but he was really just a guest playing with the switches. The glass box was breaking. The memory of Christmas night played out in my mind with clinical clarity. There was no festive warmth in the glass house. Jasmine had finished her third glass of expensive Chardonnay, pacing the pristine kitchen island, while Cody lounged on the sofa, scrolling mindlessly through his phone. I was standing near the hallway, exhausted from a double shift at the hospital, wearing my blue scrubs. My purse was resting open on the counter. Jasmine stopped pacing. Her eyes darted to the worn plastic edge of Christian's bank card peeking out of my wallet. "Hand that over, Hannah," she said, her voice carrying that familiar, dangerous edge of authority. "You are completely irresponsible with finances. You don't even know how to invest. Let me manage Christian's account for you." It was a direct command. For 23 years, I had always surrendered. I had always bowed my head and handed over whatever they demanded to keep the peace. But that night, Christian's voice echoed in my memory. "Promise me you won't let them take it." "No," I said quietly. Christian gave it to me. The silence that followed was absolute. Cody stopped scrolling. Jasmine's face went entirely rigid. her jaw clenching so tight the veins in her neck stood out. I had disrupted the system. I had stepped out of line. Jameson did not say a word. He didn't have to. He simply pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his thumb swiping across the screen in a practiced, fluid motion. A second later, the digital vent above my head clicked loudly. The warm air instantly stopped blowing. He had cut the heat to my section of the house. It was his standard, silent punishment for disobedience. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I turned around and walked toward the front door. The winter air outside was brutal, hovering in the low 20s. I just wanted to go out to my car and grab my heavy wool coat from the back seat. I stepped out onto the porch, the freezing snow instantly soaking through my thin socks. Behind me, the heavy magnetic lock engaged with a loud, mechanical thud. I turned around. The door was sealed. Jasmine was standing on the other side of the glass. She wasn't angry. She looked incredibly calm, almost triumphant. She leaned close to the thick pane of glass, her breath fogging the surface. "You can't do anything on your own, Hannah," she said, her voice muffled but perfectly clear. "You're pathetic." She turned her back and walked away. Cody reached over and pulled the heavy curtains shut, plunging the porch into darkness. They genuinely believed I would stand there in the snow, freezing and crying, until I was willing to surrender the card. They made a fatal mistake. When I finally left Marlene's downtown office, I did not drive back to the depressing, smoke-stained motel room. I drove toward the older, tree-lined suburbs of the city. I parked my car in front of a modest, slightly weathered craftsman house with a large wraparound porch. This was the home of Iolanthe. Iolanthe was 65 years old, a retired head nurse who had mentored me through my very first, terrifying years in the emergency room. She had seen me perform CPR on dying patients. She had seen me wash blood off my hands at 3 a.m. She knew exactly what I was capable of, long before I ever believed in myself. I knocked on her front door. When she opened it, the contrast to my biological family's house was staggering. Iolanthe's home was not a sterile museum. It was delightfully chaotic. There were stacks of paperback books on the floor, vibrant woven rugs, and the deep, comforting smell of roasting chicken and cinnamon in the air. It smelled like safety. She looked at my pale face, the dark circles under my eyes, and my wrinkled scrubs. She didn't ask a single probing question. She didn't demand an explanation. She simply reached out, grabbed my arm, and pulled me out of the cold. "Sit down at the table," Iolanthe ordered, using her firm, undeniable hospital voice. "I am getting you hot tea and soup." I sat at her scarred wooden kitchen table. For the first time in 48 hours, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion. As I drank the tea, I quietly told her everything. I told her about the lockout in the snow. I told her about the bank manager. I told her about the irrevocable trust, the unpaid bills, and Marlene Barker's legal strategy. I expected her to express pity. I expected her to hug me and tell me how sorry she was that my parents were monsters. Iolanthe did not offer empty pity. She sat across from me, placed her warm hands firmly over mine, and looked at me with fierce, burning pride. "They thought they were locking out a frightened little girl," Iolanthe said, her voice steady and hard. "They forgot they were locking out a trauma nurse. You are not staying in a motel, Hannah. You are staying in my spare room. You will eat my food, you will sleep in a warm bed, and you will fight this war with a clear head." I looked around the warm, messy kitchen. Jasmine would have hated this house. Jasmine would have called it cluttered and cheap. But sitting across from Iolanthe, feeling the warmth seep back into my bones, I realized that blood does not make a family. Loyalty does. Protection does. I was not alone anymore. For the next 3 days, the heavy oak table in Marlene Barker's law office became my second home. We did not build a case based on my feelings. We built a case based entirely on forensic accounting. I sat beside Marlene, carefully sorting through 2 years of meticulously printed bank statements, credit card bills, and digital payment receipts. The contrast laid bare on the paper was staggering. The documents painted a vivid, undeniable picture of financial parasitism. Marlene highlighted every single utility payment I had made for the smart home. I had paid the massive electricity bills required to run Jameson's complex servers. I had paid the property taxes on time, every single quarter, because Jasmine claimed her corporate funds were temporarily tied up in investments. I had bought their organic groceries, their imported waters, and paid the premium fiber optic internet bill that kept their entire digital lifestyle afloat. Then, Marlene pulled the bank records that Nora had legally secured regarding my parents' joint accounts. While I was working exhausted double shifts in the emergency room to keep the lights on, Jasmine was purchasing $3,000 designer handbags. Jameson was covering the exorbitant monthly dues at an exclusive country club to maintain his illusion of architectural success. They were bleeding my income dry to fund their vanity, while simultaneously treating me like an unwanted squatter in my own home. They are classic financial abusers, Marlene said, smoothly, her pen flying across a legal pad. They use shame and obligation to extract your resources, but they made a fatal error. Hannah, they let you pay the taxes and the maintenance. In the eyes of the law, combined with Christian's irrevocable trust, they have absolutely zero claim to residency. I watched as Marlene began to draft the formal paperwork. It was an eviction notice. It was not a polite request to leave. It was a surgical, ironclad legal mandate signed by a judge, demanding they vacate the premises because they had never paid rent and because they were essentially hostile trespassers occupying a trust property without the trustee's consent. The standard 30-day grace period did not apply. Marlene was giving them exactly 48 hours to pack their designer clothes and get out of my house. I looked at the crisp white paper. It felt infinitely heavier than it looked. For my entire life, Jasmine had used her sharp words to cut me down. She had used her voice as a weapon to make me feel small, incompetent, and utterly dependent. But words are just sounds in the air. They fade. They disappear. Paper does not fade. A legal decree bearing the seal of a superior court judge is an absolute reality that no amount of narcissistic manipulation can bend. I was going to hand them a consequence they could not talk their way out of. We just needed one final piece of digital evidence to make the strike absolute. The blade was perfectly sharp. It had been exactly 5 days since the heavy magnetic door locked me out in the freezing snow. Sitting in the warm, cinnamon-scented comfort of Iolanthe's kitchen, I watched my phone screen light up with relentless frequency. Jasmine and Jameson were finally beginning to panic, though they would never admit it. Their text messages were a fascinating study in psychological manipulation. They did not send a single message asking if I was safe, or if I had found a warm place to sleep. They did not apologize. Instead, they doubled down on their delusional authority. Hannah, you are acting like a petulant child. Bring Christian's card back to the house immediately. If you apologize to your father, we might let you back inside. This silent treatment is pathetic. You are ruining our holiday week. Come home and face your responsibilities. I read every single message with a cup of hot tea in my hand. I did not feel a trace of the old, suffocating guilt. I did not feel the desperate urge to explain myself or defend my actions. I simply read the words, logged the timestamps for Marlene's legal file, and left them completely unread. I did not type a single letter in response. The silence was my heaviest armor. While they were sitting in my heated living room, frantically typing demands to a daughter they thought was broken, I was quietly taking apart the very foundation of their control. On the morning of the 5th day, I drove to the regional headquarters of the local internet service provider. I did not go to the standard customer service desk. I asked to speak directly to the regional manager, presenting Marlene's certified legal documentation, establishing my sole ownership of the estate and the irrevocable trust. Jameson had set up the entire smart home network under his own name, using my credit card to pay the premium monthly fees. The manager reviewed the deed, the trust documents, and my identification. The legal reality was undeniable. Within 20 minutes, the entire account was permanently transferred into my name. The sprawling glass mansion ran entirely on this specific fiber optic network. It was the central nervous system of Jameson's architectural masterpiece. The security cameras, the automated locks, the climate control, and the master application on his smartphone all required this connection to function. He believed he was a god because he could swipe a screen and change the temperature. He didn't realize that I now owned the atmosphere. I signed the final digital transfer document, watching my name replace his on the master administrative account. I authorized a total security override, preparing the system for a hard reset. The phantom power was gone. The absolute silence on my end finally drove Jasmine to her breaking point. Narcissists cannot handle being ignored. When their standard methods of shaming and demanding fail to produce a reaction, they escalate. They need you to feel fear so they can regain control of the narrative. At exactly 2 p.m, my phone buzzed on Iolanthe's kitchen table. It was a new message from Jasmine. It was a clear, calculated ultimatum designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. I am entirely sick of this dramatic, ungrateful behavior. Hannah, you have exactly until 5 o'clock this afternoon to walk through this door and hand over that card. If you are not here, I am packing every single piece of your cheap clothing and your nursing textbooks into black garbage bags. I will leave them on the curb in the snow for the trash collectors. The choice is yours. If this resonates, and you have ever been manipulated by family members threatening to destroy or throw away your personal belongings to force your compliance, please leave a comment below. You are not alone in that experience. I stared at the glowing screen. A year ago, that text would have sent me into a blind panic. I would have abandoned my shift at the hospital, raced home, and tearfully begged her not to throw away my expensive medical textbooks. I would have surrendered all my boundaries just to protect my few possessions. Jasmine was banking on that exact reaction. She thought she was holding a gun to my head. Iolanthe walked up behind me and read the message over my shoulder. She let out a low, disgusted scoff. "She is digging her own grave," Iolanthe murmured, placing a warm hand on my shoulder. "Are you ready?" "Yes," I said smoothly. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I felt a quiet, profound sense of victory. Jasmine had not terrified me. She had simply handed me a strict, convenient timeline for my own plan. She had drawn a line in the sand at 5 o'clock, completely unaware that a tidal wave was already approaching the shore. I forwarded the text message directly to Marlene. It was perfect. It was documented proof of an illegal threat to destroy property within a home she did not legally own. It was the final piece of evidence we needed to justify a civil police escort. I stood up from the wooden table and grabbed my car keys. I smoothed the wrinkles from my dark wool coat. I was not going back to beg for my belongings. I was going back to claim my entire estate. The trap was finally set. I did not race back to the glass house in a state of tearful panic. I drove calmly to the local sheriff's precinct. Marlene had already made the necessary phone calls. A quiet, broad-shouldered deputy named Davis was waiting for me at the front desk. I handed him the thick legal folder. He reviewed the certified deed, the irrevocable trust documents, the eviction notice, and the threatening text message Jasmine had sent just an hour prior. Deputy Davis nodded slowly, his expression professional and unreadable. He agreed to provide a civil standby to ensure there was no breach of peace when I re-entered my own property. I also had a second passenger waiting in the parking lot. It was the lead field technician from the internet service provider, sitting in a marked utility van. We arrived at the edge of my property at exactly 4:30 in the afternoon. The sky was beginning to darken, casting long, cold shadows over the pristine snow. I did not walk up to the front door and knock. I did not ask for permission to enter. I stood in the freezing driveway beside the technician as he opened the heavy metal utility box near the front gate. He connected his rugged laptop directly to the main fiber optic terminal. Administrative credentials verified, the technician said quietly, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Executing total system override now. I watched the massive glass house from the driveway. For 3 agonizing seconds, the entire property went completely dark. The exterior security lights shut off. The hum of the massive servers died down. The smart home was effectively blinded. Then, the system rebooted. When the lights flickered back on, the digital architecture of the house had been entirely rewritten. The master application rights were permanently stripped from Jameson's smartphone. The complex encryption keys were wiped and replaced. Every single automated lock, every security camera, and the entire climate control matrix transferred directly to the phone in my pocket. I pulled out my device. The screen glowed with a brand new interface. It read, "Welcome, Hannah. Master access granted." Jameson had spent years using this system to make me feel small. He had used it to freeze me out, to lock doors in my face, and to silently demand my absolute obedience. He thought his power was absolute. But power is just code, and code obeys the person who pays the bills. I tapped the screen once, remotely unlocking the heavy magnetic front door. It disengaged with a loud, satisfying mechanical click that echoed across the quiet, snowy yard. Deputy Davis stepped out of his cruiser and walked up to stand right beside me. I held the only key. This is the beautiful, absolute truth about the law and digital architecture. Emotional abusers thrive in the murky, gray areas of human feeling. They expertly twist words. They gaslight your memory. And they rewrite family history to constantly position themselves as the victims. They rely on your confusion and your guilt to maintain their authority. But you cannot gaslight a server log. You cannot emotionally manipulate metadata. When a judge looks at a case, they do not care about Jasmine's flawless corporate presentation or Jameson's smooth, charming architectural speeches. They care about process. They care about paper. And they care about indisputable, time-stamped data. In the eyes of the law, there is a massive, impenetrable wall between usage rights and ownership rights. Jameson and Jasmine were simply glorified tenants living in a luxury hotel they could not afford. My irrevocable trust proved total ownership. My meticulous bank statements proved absolute financial maintenance. And now, the newly extracted digital server logs proved a pattern of abuse. The metadata showed the exact time Jameson intentionally manipulated the climate control to drop the temperature in my room. It showed the precise second he engaged the magnetic lock to trap me outside in the freezing snow on Christmas night. It was a cold, perfectly preserved digital footprint of their cruelty. A narcissist always believes their mouth is their greatest weapon. They think if they just speak loudly enough, with enough conviction, reality will bend to their will. But paper and code do not care about volume. They only care about facts. Standing on the porch, feeling the icy wind against my face, I realized that Jameson's entire identity was tied to a fake throne. He had built $1 million cage of glass and steel. But he forgot to check whose name was actually on the land beneath it. I did not need to scream at them. I did not need to cry and demand an apology for a lifetime of being treated like a disposable asset. I did not need closure from them, because I was bringing my own. I held the eviction notice in my left hand. I held my phone with the master application in my right hand. Deputy Davis stood firmly behind my shoulder, a silent representative of the state. I looked through the glass. Jasmine was standing by the kitchen island, holding a black garbage bag, waiting for the pathetic stray dog to come crawling back to beg. It was time to enter. At exactly 4:50 in the afternoon, I walked up the pristine, snow-cleared pathway to the front entrance of the glass mansion. I did not knock on the heavy wood and steel door. I did not ring the digital doorbell that sent a high-definition video feed directly to Jameson's phone. I reached out and placed my bare finger against the biometric scanner. For 2 entire years, that scanner had been programmed to reject my fingerprint. Jameson had always claimed it was a security protocol, a way to ensure only the primary owners had absolute access to the estate. Now, the system recognized the new master administrator. The heavy magnetic lock disengaged with a deep, resonating click that echoed across the quiet property. I pushed the door open and stepped into the expansive foyer. The house was incredibly warm. While I had been freezing in a cheap motel room, Jameson and Jasmine had been enjoying a luxurious 72 degrees. The air smelled of expensive pine candles and roasted garlic. I walked quietly into the main living room. The scene in front of me was a perfect, sickening portrait of narcissistic entitlement. Jasmine was lounging on the white Italian leather sofa, holding a crystal glass of white wine. She was wearing a silk robe, her feet resting on the heated glass coffee table. Jameson was sitting in his custom recliner, watching a golf tournament on the massive flat-screen television. Over in the corner, near the grand staircase, I saw 3 large black garbage bags. They were filled with my nursing scrubs, my heavy medical textbooks, and the few framed photographs I owned of Christian. Jasmine had actually followed through on her threat. She had packed up my entire existence into trash bags, ready to throw me out into the snow like common refuse. They did not hear me enter over the sound of the television. They were completely relaxed, entirely confident that their psychological warfare had worked. They were waiting for 5 o'clock. They were waiting for me to walk through the door, shivering and defeated, ready to hand over Christian's trust card and beg for my cheap clothing. I stood in the center of the living room, simply watching them. I felt no anger. I felt no heartbreak over the black garbage bags in the corner. I only felt a cold, clinical precision. Deputy Davis stepped through the front door behind me. His heavy boots made a soft thud against the polished hardwood floor. Marlene walked in right after him, holding a thick, black leather briefcase. The soft sound of their footsteps finally caught Jameson's attention. He turned his head away from the television screen, expecting to see his broken daughter. Instead, he saw his reckoning. The game was finally over. Jameson froze, the remote control slipping slightly in his grip. Jasmine turned her head, her wine glass stopping halfway to her mouth. For 3 long seconds, absolute silence dominated the massive, open-concept living room. The golf commentator on the television was the only sound in the house. Jasmine's initial shock quickly morphed into her default state of arrogant irritation. She did not notice Deputy Davis or Marlene standing in the shadows of the foyer. She only saw me, standing confidently in the center of her perfect room, not shivering, not crying, and not holding out a bank card. "I see you finally figured out how to use the keypad," Jasmine sneered, setting her wine glass down on the coaster. "You are 10 minutes early. Hannah, I hope you brought the card, and I hope you are ready to apologize to your father for ruining our holiday." I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I walked slowly over to the center of the room and stopped directly in front of the glass coffee table. I reached into my coat pocket. I pulled out a brand new, silver metallic keycard. I placed it gently on the glass surface. Next to the keycard, I set down a thick, bound legal folder with the seal of the Superior Court stamped on the front page. "I am not here to apologize. Jasmine," I said. My voice was completely even, matching the tone I used when delivering a patient's prognosis. "And I am not giving you Christian's money." Jameson stood up from his recliner. His face flushed red with immediate, aggressive anger. "Excuse me," he barked, taking a step toward me. "You do not walk into my house and speak to your mother that way. Get out. Get out right now until you learn some respect. It is not your house. Jameson, A calm, authoritative voice echoed from the hallway. Marlene stepped out of the shadows and walked into the bright light of the living room. She was wearing a sharp gray suit, her expression entirely professional. Behind her, Deputy Davis stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. Jasmine gasped, her eyes darting to the police uniform. The color instantly drained from her perfectly manicured face. Jameson stopped in his tracks, his aggressive posture faltering as he processed the presence of law enforcement in his private sanctuary. "Who are you people?" Jameson demanded, though his voice lacked its usual booming authority. "Why is there a police officer in my living room?" Marlene did not smile. She walked over and stood right beside me. She opened the heavy legal folder on the glass table and flattened the first page with the palm of her hand. The paperwork was flawlessly prepared. I watched their reality shatter. If this resonates, and you are wondering exactly what narcissists do when they are backed into a legal corner with absolutely no way out, keep watching. Their reaction is always a masterclass in denial. Marlene looked directly at Jameson and Jasmine. She did not introduce herself with pleasantries. She pointed a manicured finger at the top document in the folder. "My name is Marlene Barker. I am the lead attorney representing the sole trustee and legal owner of this estate, Hannah," Marlene stated clearly. "I am serving you with a formal, court-ordered notice of eviction." Jasmine let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. It sounded brittle and high-pitched. "Eviction, you must be out of your mind. We own this house. My husband designed this house. Hannah is just our ungrateful daughter who rents a room." I slid the document across the smooth glass table so it rested directly in front of Jasmine. "You do not own this house, Jasmine," I said calmly. "You have never owned it, and you have never paid a single utility bill to maintain it. For the last 2 years, I have been paying the electricity, the water, and the internet. I have the digital receipts for every single transaction. You are nothing but hostile occupants." Jameson stared at the paper. He saw the official court seal. He saw the signature of a superior court judge. He saw the bold letters demanding that all unauthorized residents vacate the premises within 48 hours. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. He looked at Deputy Davis. "Officer, this is a ridiculous family dispute," Jameson said, attempting to use his charming, authoritative architect voice. "My daughter has a history of mental instability. She is clearly having a breakdown. I want her and this supposed lawyer removed from my property immediately." Deputy Davis did not move. He kept his hands on his belt and looked at Jameson with a bored, unimpressed expression. "Sir, I have reviewed the certified deed and the property records at the station before coming here," Deputy Davis said, his voice flat. "The documentation is valid. This property legally belongs to the young woman standing in front of you. You are the one who needs to comply with the court order." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. A police officer had just confirmed their worst nightmare. They could not charm their way out of this. They could not gaslight a man wearing a badge. Jasmine looked down at the paper again. Her hands began to shake. The illusion of her massive wealth was evaporating right in front of her eyes. She turned to Jameson in a panic. The fortress was falling apart. Jasmine refused to accept the truth. Slapping the glass table, she screamed, "This is a forgery. Jameson and I built this estate. You cannot steal a house with a fake paper." Marlene calmly produced a stack of heavily stamped documents. "You secured the initial loans." "Jasmine." Marlene cut in like a scalpel. "But 3 years ago, Jameson's firm faced bankruptcy. You defaulted. The bank was hours away from foreclosure." Jameson flinched, looking away. Jasmine stared at him in shock. He had hidden the depths of their ruin. Christian stepped in. Marlene continued. "He paid the mortgage in cash and placed the estate into an irrevocable trust. Upon your 21st birthday, Ownership automatically transferred to you. I looked at Jasmine, the woman who always called me a burden, standing in a house I had secretly owned for 2 years. Christian built this trust so you could never touch me again, I said quietly. No, Christian wouldn't leave us with nothing, Jasmine whispered. He left you exactly what you earned. Jameson lunged, pulling out his smartphone with shaking hands. You think you can take my masterpiece? He spat. I control every system in this building. I am locking this house down. He tapped his screen furiously. Nothing happened. Jameson swiped his screen again, panicking. What is wrong with the network? I pulled out my glowing smartphone. It isn't responding because you are no longer the administrator, I said evenly. You used my credit card to pay the internet bill. The account is mine, and I executed a total system override this morning. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His digital throne was gone. I tapped the climate control icon and adjusted the slider. The television shut off, the lights powered down, and a wave of warm air flooded the room. I control the temperature, I stated. And I control the doors. Jasmine sank onto the sofa, completely broken. Cody slowly backed away up the stairs. Jameson dropped his phone. You have 48 hours to pack. Marlene snapped her briefcase shut. Take any fixtures, and you will be charged with theft. Deputy Davis will monitor your transition. I didn't wait for their excuses. I turned my back, left the eviction notice on the table, and stepped out into the night. Halfway across the driveway, the front door swung open. Jameson stepped out, his panic entirely replaced by a chilling arrogance. Deputy Davis, stop her, he called out smoothly. Marlene and I paused. Jameson handed the officer a crisp document. My daughter has a history of severe mental instability. She forged this eviction notice. He offered a sickening smile. We are going to get you psychiatric help, Hannah. But first, Deputy, arrest her for forging a judge's signature. He thought he had won. I simply looked at Marlene. The trap was springing shut. Marlene smiled like a predator. A power of attorney, she said. May I see the date, Deputy? October 15th of last year, Davis replied, shining his flashlight on the text. Marlene opened her briefcase, handing the officer 2 sealed folders. Fascinating, according to these medical records. Christian was in a medically induced coma on that exact date. He lacked all capacity to sign anything. Jameson's confident posture shattered. It gets worse. Marlene relentlessly continued. The metadata for that electronic signature originated from the router inside this very house. At 2 p.m, Jameson turned a sickening shade of gray. You forged a dead man's signature using your own internet connection, I said clearly. Officer, Marlene added. Forging a financial document to deprive a trustee is wire fraud. Jameson stumbled backward. He had just handed the police the murder weapon. Deputy Davis reviewed the records, let out a heavy sigh, and radioed for transport. Sir, put your hands behind your back, he ordered. Wait, I built this house, Jameson stammered. The sharp click of the handcuffs echoed in the freezing air, the sound of a 23-year nightmare snapping shut. Jasmine burst onto the porch. She didn't cry for her husband. The neighbors, she shrieked. My career is ruined. Inside, Cody was quietly sneaking out the back with a stuffed duffel bag. Watching the toxic ecosystem devour itself, I realized I was the only healthy person who had ever lived in that house. As Deputy Davis placed Jameson in the cruiser, the glass house was finally mine. The cruiser's lights faded into the snow. I used the biometric scanner, which now recognized me as the master administrator, and stepped back inside. The silence wasn't oppressive. It was peaceful. Ignoring the garbage bags holding my scrubs, I systematically removed their cold metal sculptures and monochrome paintings, stripping away the architecture of their narcissism. Taking out my phone, I permanently deleted Jameson and Jasmine's profiles from the smart home network. I slid the thermostat to 74 degrees. Warm air flooded the room, melting the rigid chill. The invisible cage was permanently broken. 2 years later, the sterile furniture was replaced by a warm velvet sectional and a scarred oak table. It was Christmas Eve. The sprawling kitchen, once kept meticulously empty, was alive with the smell of roasted turkey and joyful chaos. Iolanthe laughed by the oven, and Marlene casually sipped wine. My fellow nurses decorated a lopsided pine tree. This was my chosen family. Free from Jasmine's emotional abuse. My career skyrocketed to head charge nurse. Iolanthe and I even established a scholarship for nursing students from abusive homes. Standing by the island with hot cider, Iolanthe tapped her glass against my mug with a knowing smile. We were a real family. The legal system crushed them. Jameson's forgery earned him a felony conviction, 3 years probation, and massive restitution. His architectural license was revoked, and his firm collapsed. Jasmine's corporate facade fell with him. Fired from her CFO position, they were forced into a cramped apartment. Drowning in debt, she bitterly blamed Cody, who still refused to work. A week before Christmas, I received a carefully worded letter from Jasmine, demanding I fulfill my moral duty to help them. Feeling only profound indifference, I fed the unopened card directly into my paper shredder. I never looked back. I stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee. Snow was falling, just like the night I was locked out 2 years ago. Society insists we must forgive our abusers to truly heal. I disagree. You can build a thriving life without absolving those who tried to break you. You can forgive the fire for burning, but you are not obligated to touch the flame again. Christian understood that true legacy is defined by the boundaries you protect. My parents tried to freeze me out, but they only taught me how to build my own fire. You do not have to stand in the snow and wait for them to open the door. You always hold the key.